The Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on examining the President's fiscal year 2024 budget request for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Office of Insular Affairs. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. The subcommittee is meeting today to conduct oversight of the budget request for the agencies under our jurisdiction. As I stated in our first budget hearing, under the Constitution, Congress has the power to tax and to spend, and we have a responsibility to make sure that it is done wisely. There are finite federal resources, and agencies must be held accountable for their spending and prioritization of programs and policies. Federal funding for programs and services for federally recognized Indian tribes and U.S. Insular Affairs spans several federal agencies. However, the majority of that spending falls within two Department of Interior agencies, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, and the Office of Insular Affairs, or OIA. This hearing will focus on the President's fiscal year 2024 budget request for BIA and OIA, along with how best to allocate funds and what changes may need to be made. Over the past several years, there has been a substantial increase in federal funding across agencies and programs, including those that serve Native communities. This increased spending means a higher deficit and intense concern from many Americans about the fiscal future facing our nation. We are at $32 trillion in debt, and that is unsustainable. Beginning with the BIA, this agency is charged with honoring the United States Treaty and Trust responsibilities towards American Indians and Alaska Natives and the 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. The agency administers 55 million surface acres and 57 million acres of subsurface mineral estates held in trust by the United States for tribes and for individual American Indians and Alaska Natives. It also provides programs for tribes that address community services, public safety, and to encourage economic opportunity for Native communities. The President's budget proposes a $684 million increase for the BIA for fiscal year 2024. It proposes to transfer 105L leases and contract support costs to mandatory spending, which would then bypass the appropriation process. It also proposes to focus more resources on conservation, so-called climate change, and energy development that is allegedly renewable, which can have its own profound impacts on our environment, our wildlife, and our fisheries. Not to mention the fact that such energy resources are astronomically expensive and tend to be viable only with substantial federal subsidies, which increases our cost of energy across the board, resulting in energy poverty, including within our Native communities. This focus on so-called climate change and alternative energy cannot take away from the BIA's responsibility to ensure tribes are not limited in opportunity for natural resource development on their tribal lands, which is an issue that has been brought to me repeatedly by numerous tribes from around the country. For many tribes, real property holdings are the basis for social, cultural, and religious life, and often their single most important economic resource. Access to resource development cannot be pared back in the name of broadly and nebulously defined climate goals. History has shown that we can balance conservation and resource development, and tribes are actually the experts on this. They have knowledge and the experience to make it work, and BIA should be supporting those efforts of self-determination. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget also includes a proposed $30.5 million for tribal land consolidation, without indicating that intensive improvements have been made from the way that previous land buyback programs have been managed. Throwing more money at the complicated issue of land fractionation will not get us anywhere without reconsidering how to deal with the issue of probate and focusing resources on how to pursue outcomes on this issue that are the very best for our tribes. Turning to the OIA. This is an agency charged with carrying out responsibilities for U.S. insular areas. This includes the U.S. territories of Puerto Rico, American Samoa, as well as implementing the Compacts of Free Association, or COFA, for the Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. OIA's budget shows a $211 million decrease for fiscal year 2024. My understanding, however, is that this reflects the expiration of the economic assistance to the Marshall Islands and Micronesia under the current COFA, and the fiscal year 2024 budget does not include proposals for a future COFA that is in the process of being renegotiated. While it was expected that this information would be communicated separately, I would encourage this administration to be more open and communicative regarding how much funding future COFA agreements will cost, and have a discussion with Congress about where that funding should come from and which department receives and administers it. Continuing oversight of BIA and OIA to ensure they are fulfilling their mission efficiently and effectively for the benefit of Native communities and the insular areas is a main priority of this subcommittee. Today, that means having a productive discussion about these agencies' budgets and where resources should be allocated. Both BIA and OIA are charged with the responsibility of maintaining the important relationships between the U.S. government and the tribes and the U.S. insular areas, respectively. I want to thank the witnesses for being here to testify today, and I look forward to your testimony. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member for her statement.
Thank you so very much, Chairwoman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. And I do think that we are sitting at this moment on this dais and with these witnesses at a critical point of how do we view the priorities regarding the budget. We must remember that a budget is a reflection on our values, and today we have a sharp contrast on Republicans' and Democrats' vision of those priorities. Republicans' priority at this moment is to create a crisis, a needless crisis over the debt limit. They call for drastic cuts to spending for those who most depend on our federal funding. It's hypocritical, I believe, to call for these drastic cuts when it was under Republican leadership that the bulk of this deficit was created. The Trump administration added $8 trillion to the deficit. The Trump administration added up to $8 trillion to the deficit. The next largest contribution to the deficit was also under a Republican president, and that was of President Bush. These deficits were not needed. They were not incurred to help working Americans, but they were targeted to the wealthiest and largest corporations among us. The Trump tax cuts alone, which benefited the wealthiest in America, added $2 trillion to the deficit. Now let's contrast that with this administration. President Biden, under the first 2 years, decreased the deficit by $1.4 trillion under the first 2 fiscal years. So we can see that Democrat presidents, and when the House and Senate are under Democrat control, we decrease the deficit, even as we were investing in what truly needed to be done, responding to the pandemic, making sure people had an ability to get back to work. We've now increased unemployment, so it is at projected levels from before the pandemic ever hit. And so let's look at the budget, of which this budget that you are presenting is part of. That budget is anticipated to be part of a plan to continue to decrease the deficit. There has been placed by this president a budget that would reduce the deficit by close to $4 trillion without harming the most vulnerable among us. So I want to talk a little bit more about what the Republican Default on America plan would mean. It would lead to 1,500 fewer tribal law enforcement personnel, 500 fewer teachers and other school staff, 25% less funding available for basic education, and a delay in funding construction for the schools. I've been to those tribally based schools, and they need work. Some of them look like they can be condemned, and sadly, many of our tribal buildings where our children learn have been condemned. So I want to look at what you're proposing, which is part of this larger budget, which would indeed bring down the deficit. And the reason it brings down the deficit is this administration is willing to increase revenues. It's not just about cutting spending, it's increasing revenues, and there's ways to do it that are fair. You know, a minimum tax, making sure that everybody pays their taxes. Let the IRS go after those millionaire and billionaire tax cheats. That's what we need to have happen. Because what we have presented here is key increases for initiatives like law enforcement for murdered and missing Indigenous peoples, economic development projects, native language revitalization, climate resilience grants, because it is not a so-called climate crisis. We are living through that climate crisis, forestry projects, and Indian land consolidation. The budget also proposes $199 million for BIA construction activities. That includes public safety facilities as well as irrigation and dam infrastructure. So I know that these funding increases are so needed at the agency because one of the reasons why we don't get stuff done fast enough, and we want you to get stuff done a lot faster, is you need people. We need personnel. So with that, I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
Now I will introduce our witnesses. Mr. Brian Newland, Assistant Secretary, Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., and Ms. Carmen Cantor, Assistant Secretary for Insular and International Affairs, Office of Insular Affairs, Washington, D.C. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We use timing lights, and when you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute left, the light will turn yellow, and at the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow all witnesses on the panel to testify before member questioning. Their chair now recognizes Mr. Newland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, members of the committee and ranking member. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today to present testimony on President Biden's FY24 budget request for Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior. This budget request includes $4.7 billion in funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Education, and the Bureau of Trust Funds Administration, as well as programmatic functions within the Office of the Assistant Secretary. It also includes proposed mandatory reclassifications for contract support costs and 105L tribal leases. The total request for the Bureau of Indian Affairs is $3 billion, which would include $642 million for public safety and justice operations, an increase of $62 million. Operational funding supports expanding tribal needs in policing, detention, as well as tribal courts. To strengthen tribal homelands, the budget also includes a language proposal for the Carcieri Fix, which will ensure that all federally recognized tribes have the same ability to place land into trust. The BIA is also requesting $30.5 million for the Indian Land Consolidation Program to continue addressing fractionation of Indian lands. And the budget also includes $12 million for the creation of a new tribal land and water conservation fund acquisition program for tribes. As part of our government-wide efforts to strengthen tribal communities, Our budget includes an increase of $38 million. This includes $79 million for social services, which will support expanded implementation of the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act. In addition, our budget includes increases of $26 million to expand the Tiwahe initiative through several human services programs, including the Housing Improvement Program. Our budget also includes an additional $27 million investment in native language revitalization, which is crucial to preserve endangered tribal languages and has been highlighted as a priority through the Secretary's Boarding School Initiative. The budget also proposes $2.8 billion in new mandatory funding over 10 years for tribal water rights settlement requirements, including $2.5 billion to cover the costs of enacted and future settlements, and $340 million for ongoing costs associated with settlements that have already been enacted and that are managed by the Bureau of Reclamation. The budget also invests in infrastructure needs in Indian country. For example, we include an increase of $24 million for replacement and deferred maintenance projects to address public safety and justice facilities, particularly our BIA jail system. The budget includes $51 million for road maintenance, an increase of $12 million to support maintenance activities on roads across Indian country. We're also seeking limited additional funding to meet our staffing needs across Indian Affairs, including building up our capacity through the White House Council on Native American Affairs, which coordinates activities across all federal agencies, as well as addressing the growing demand on our staff by tribal requests for 105L tribal leases. The President's FY24 budget request for BIE programs at the department totals $1.6 billion. This includes $416 million for education construction to replace and repair school facilities and address deferred maintenance across our BIE school system. Out of our 163 schools in the BIE system, more than 80 are listed as in poor condition. This funding will help ensure that all Native students have a quality learning environment. With respect to the Bureau of Trust Funds Administration, we are seeking $109 million. This is actually $2.2 million below the FY23 enacted amount, which reflects a proposed transfer of funding for probate work within the Office of Hearings and Appeals from BTFA to BIA to address our probate backlog. And we also want to encourage Congress to accept the BTFA organizational structure in the FY24 appropriations bill. BTFA provides a unique federal trust function that must remain separate from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We believe that this budget proposal reflects the United States and the President's commitment to upholding our trust and treaty responsibilities and will improve life for Indian people in tribal communities across Indian country. Thank you, Madam Chair. I look forward to answering any questions you and members may have.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Cantor for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the Committee on Natural Resources. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the fiscal year 2024 budget request for the Office of Insular Affairs, or OIA. OIA is responsible for administering the federal government's relationship with the territories of American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, CNMI, Guam, and the United States Virgin Islands, USVI. OIA also administers the financial assistance provided to the freely associated states of the Federated States of Micronesia, FSM, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, RMI, and the Republic of Palau under the Compacts of Free Association. The proposed fiscal year 2024 Insular Affairs budget totals $536.6 million, a decrease of $211.5 million from the 2023 enacted appropriation. This decrease is almost entirely attributed to the expiration of certain financial provisions of the 2003 Compacts of Free Association. The request for current appropriations for 2024 is $122.3 million. This amount is a decrease of $6.6 million from the 2023 enacted appropriation. Included in this amount, in this current appropriation request, are $94.5 million in discretionary funding and $27.7 million in mandatory funding. The President's 2024 budget request continues support for core OIA programs within the Assistance to Territories appropriation. These programs provide the territories with much-needed funding for the delivery of public services such as health and education, infrastructure investments, and technical assistance. In addition to these important activities, the 2024 budget also seeks to advance energy independence of the insular areas by providing $15.5 million to the Energizing Insular Communities program. The administration is committed to energy projects that promote energy security as well as projects that support a clean energy future for the insular areas through investments in renewable energy development. The U.S. territories and freely associated states face significant challenges related to infrastructure and resiliency. The 2024 request calls for a $4 million increase dedicated to infrastructure investments in the territories through the Capital Improvement Project Program, $31.7 million, a program which has had level funding of $27.7 million annually since 1996. Sea level rise and the increasing severity of weather events compound infrastructure challenges and require OIA programs to help the insular areas adapt, become more resilient, and thrive. The President's budget supports these priorities for the insular areas by providing technical expertise and investments aimed to fortify and strengthen both their public infrastructure and natural resources. OIA's technical assistance, Energizing Insular Communities, coral reef and natural resources, capital improvement project grants, and maintenance assistance programs all contribute to strengthen island communities. The Department of the Interior looks forward to working with Congress on the Compact Impact Fairness Act as introduced in the 118th Congress. The administration supports allowing compact migrants to become eligible for key federal programs while living in the U.S. as a long-term solution to the financial impacts of compact migrants on U.S. state and territorial governments. For 2024, permanent mandatory commitments include an estimated $380 million for fiscal payments to Guam and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Guam is estimated to receive $80 million in income tax payments attributable to military and federal personnel stationed in Guam, and the Virgin Islands is estimated to collect around $300 million for excise taxes paid to the federal government on rum produced in the Virgin Islands. Permanent mandatory funding also includes $34.3 million provided to the Republic of the Marshall Islands under the Military Use and Operating Rights Agreement, which is a subsidiary agreement under the Compacts of Free Association. All other permanent mandatory funding under the 2003 COFA expires in 2023. Negotiations are ongoing related to the renewal of our Compacts of Free Association relationships in fiscal year 24 and beyond. The budget request includes language that demonstrates the administration's support for funding the renewal of our Compact of Free Association relationships with FSM, RMI, and Palau. The 2024 budget request seeks $7.1 billion in economic assistance over 20 years to be provided through a mandatory appropriation at the Department of State, with language calling for continued implementation of the compacts at the Department of the Interior. This total includes $6.5 billion for direct economic assistance and $634 million for continued U.S. postal services to the freely associated states. The U.S. remains committed to its long-standing partnerships with the governments and the people of the freely associated states as we work together to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. Madam Chair, it is a pleasure to appear before the subcommittee, to discuss the 2024 budget request for the Office of Insular Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, and we thank both of the witnesses for your testimony and the information you provided. The chair will now recognize members for 5 minutes for questions, beginning with me. The Department of Interior recently proposed new land to trust regulations and tribal regulations just as recently as December 2022. That comment period ended on March 1st, 2023. The committee has heard from several tribes and stakeholders that they wanted additional time to comment on these regulations and that more time to provide comments would be beneficial. Have you heard the same concerns from tribes and stakeholders regarding these new regulations?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have not heard that from any tribes that I'm aware of. We did get several requests from members of the public to extend the comment period, but we did not extend beyond what we had already provided in the notice.
This is a pretty complicated area, isn't it?
The land in the trust process?
Yes.
It can be.
Okay. Would you consider extending the comment period so that tribes and members of the public can fully participate in this rulemaking?
Madam Chair, we've received hundreds of comments on these proposed regulations and believe that we have met our commitment under the law and we're intend to proceed with the rulemaking.
Okay. Mr. Newland, when was the last time there was a complete audit of the BIA?
I don't have that answer for you. I'd have to follow up, ma'am.
Okay. Ms. Cantor, the Department of Interior has received $6.6 billion in funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, or, well, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. The committee is concerned that specific IRA programs addressing climate change overlap with other existing non-IRA programs. It looks like grant awardees could potentially qualify for multiple grants for the same project, creating the risk of double dipping and wasteful spending. What measures are in place to prevent multiple grants from being awarded for the same project, both before the grant is awarded and then through oversight while the grant funds are being expended?
Madam Chair, we have a very competitive process and a process that requires assessments of all these requests that we receive. To my knowledge, we don't have any projects that have been submitted twice and have received funding, more than once. I will go back and check, but my understanding is that because of the process, full, proof process that we have, that's not the case.
Well, is there a checklist or some other mechanism by which OIA staff verifies that there is no wasteful duplication?
My understanding is that we have checklists that we follow.
Who ultimately at OIA is accountable for preventing waste, fraud, and abuse? Who at OIA is accountable for preventing waste, fraud, and abuse in terms of the money that you are appropriated for these kinds of programs?
Madam Chair, we all follow all the rules, and I'm responsible for, making sure that my staff follows all the rules and procedures.
Okay. Mr. Newland, just a couple more questions. I wanted to ask about the Indian Land Consolidation Program and the budget request for purchasing highly fractionalized land. I have here that the department testified back in 2017 that the amount of funds allocated to the land buyback program resulting from the Cobell settlement did very little to reduce Indian land fractionalization. Why does the department think that another $22.5 million will be beneficial to consolidate fractionated Indian land when the department testified just a few years ago that funds allocated under the Cobell settlement did very little to reduce this problem?
Madam Chair, I disagree with that assessment from that testimony. Through the Cobell settlement, we were able to consolidate more than 100,000 fractionated parcels with 3 million equivalent acres of land returned to tribal trust status. The request is intended because, as you noted in your opening comment, probate is an issue. And we're also attempting to address that through this budget request with the transfer of some of the probate functions over to a different part of the Office of Hearings and Appeals. But if we don't continue these investments, land will go out of trust through the fractionation process. And by 2038, more land will be fractionated in Indian country than when we started the Cobell settlement.
Okay. Just very quickly, this year's request for Assistant Secretary Administrative Support is for $1.81 million, which includes support for the Office of Self-Governance. Is the negotiated rulemaking required by Section 413 of the Progress for Indian Tribes Act? Can you explain where the funds to support that rulemaking prior to April 20th, 2023 came from? Very quickly, because I'm out of time.
I'd have to follow up with you, Madam Chair. Be happy to do that.
All right, we appreciate that. Thank you. I now recognize.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. So I want to talk a little bit about the the version of the budget you have proposed, which is part of the larger budget intended just to reduce the deficit by about $3 trillion over the 10-year period, and then what it would mean like if we actually had the cuts that are proposed in the in the law that, not law, in the act that was passed. When we look at that, if you hold the defense budget harmless, that means the rest of the agencies have to carry a larger burden, which is about 22%. It goes higher depending on where, which agency might not suffer any cuts. What does a 22% cut from fiscal year 22 levels look like at the BIA? And if you could tell me what it might look like on the ground. We know we have a lot of issues around murdered and missing Indigenous women. We know there is a crisis of law enforcement in Indian country, that we simply do not have enough law enforcement personnel on the ground, in the cars, traveling huge reservations. Can you describe a little bit of what that looks like if we had that kind of cut?
Thank you, Ranking Member. At 22%, the funding cut on Indian Affairs on its face would be bad. And when you look deeper into the numbers, it gets even worse. And I'll explain why very briefly. At those funding levels, we're talking about hundreds of officers, police officers, taken off the street in tribal communities across the country at a time when we know through government commission reports that there is a $2 billion need for public safety and justice program funding across Indian country. So we would actually widen that gap. We also have 80 schools in our BIE system that are listed in poor condition that need to be replaced. At our current pace, it will take us several decades to complete replacement of these schools. So widening that gap would string that out as well, and also affect the maintenance of those facilities. This would also reduce our ability to replace jails, which I know we have discussed a lot, and we're working to make sure that our jail facilities are up to par to meet our obligations to people in the jails. But that's just on the surface. So behind that, we've also seen a growing demand for 105L tribal leases. 5 years ago, there were no 105L leases that we funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this year, we're on pace for 300. And those are obligated, those are mandated by law, by Public Law 638, that we provide funding for that. And so as the demand for 105L leases increases, that will also put pressure on our program dollars from the other end of the spectrum. So you would return us to FY22 levels, and then the program dollars would be squeezed by the 105L leases, and that's really going to affect our ability to deliver those core trust services that we are required to provide across Indian country.
And I think that this touches on a really important piece, is that we have encouraged through the 638 contracts or compacting for tribes to actually run their own programs. And what I've seen across Indian country is that those programs are often more culturally competent to the precise location, that there is a lot of satisfaction at the tribal level to how they are running their programs, and that if we start cutting back, we are actually interfering with that process of having those who are closest to their members to be actually running the programs that serve them. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I want to just touch a bit about a bit more about what happens, Honorable Cantor, with regards to what some of these kinds of cuts would have on our insular areas, on when we're dealing with storms. There's a typhoon right now impacting our areas. Talk about what that means, and you actually don't have much time, so I might want you to do it in written form, but real quickly, does it harm our ability to respond to the needs of the people in the islands?
Absolutely. You know, in any reduction scenario, a reduced OIA budget means reduces support to the, jurisdictions. And just to give you one quick example, a 1% cut translates to mostly about $1 million decrease in the funding that we provide to the jurisdiction. So yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes of questions.
Talofa lava. Thank you, Chairman Hageman and Ranking Member Ledger Fernandez, for holding this hearing. I'd like to first send my thoughts and prayers to those recovering or harmed by the devastating super typhoon that just hit Guam and the CNMI. I also appreciate the administration's rapid emergency declaration. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I certainly support the critical missions the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Insular Affairs serve, and they are missions of mercy. As Scripture says, in His law, the islands will put their hope. That's Isaiah 42. And the people in American Samoa truly hope for oversight, accountability, and transparency from OIA. They want their federal dollars spent wisely, not wasted. My territorial colleagues and I were successful in getting the Treasury Department to permit the use of hundreds of millions of dollars of ARP funds for much-needed hospital and other infrastructure improvements. Accordingly, it's essential OIA ensures proper use of these funds for the hospital, community college, our courts, and our education department, as these are the key pillars of our society that Congress entrusted to OIA specifically to oversee. Just yesterday, Madam Secretary, I had a very productive meeting with your new director of OIA, Mr. John Brewer of the Senior Executive Service, and I appreciate the rapid and constructive engagement of all the OIA staff. Finally, I want to congratulate your OIA COFA team and Special Negotiator Ambassador Yoon on the successful signing of the recent compact renewals with the Republic of Palau and the Federated States of Micronesia. I look forward to passing these compacts in Congress over the coming months, and hopefully another one for the Marshall Islands too. These agreements are crucial for the national security of the United States, as the Pacific Territories and FAS are on the front lines once again in the battle for freedom. Madam Secretary, I co-sponsored Representative Case's CFA bill, and I want to thank him for his leadership on this to make FAS citizens in the U.S. eligible for essential federal social safety benefits. What else can be done to address the special costs and needs of the Pacific Territories in this regard, so Congress can further help mitigate the local impact of these compact agreements?
Talofa, Congresswoman Radewagen, great to see you. As you mentioned, the administration is supporting the Compact Impact Fairness Act, which Congressman Case introduced in the House. This bill is going to allow the compact migrants to become eligible to key federal programs while residing in the U.S. And it's actually a long-term solution to the financial impacts of compact migrants on state and territorial governments. As you know, not all compact migrants are just going to Guam and Hawaii. They're found all over the U.S. 50% of the 94,000 compact migrants are now all over the U.S. What I suggested to Governor Guerrero when I spoke to her about this a few weeks ago is that in addition to CFA, which we strongly support, we will be happy, OIA will be happy to implement any grants, any supplemental grants that members of, the territories advocate, here in Congress. So in addition to CFA, that's the other alternative, to continue to provide supplemental grants. If the Congress approves it, OIA will be more than ready to implement those.
Secretary Cantor, I understand the American Samoan desk officer position at OIA is in transition, and I trust your office is backstopping appropriately. But is there any update or timetable for our local government officials to be aware of for contact purposes?
Congresswoman, we have a field rep in American Samoa, Ms. Lydia, and we also have a number of staff members here in Washington, D.C. that work in on all the territories. Since I arrived in OIA last year, I've been working on an assessment of our resources. I cannot give you a timetable right now, but we're working on it.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize Mr. Sablam for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to our witnesses. Welcome. Madam Secretary Cantor, thank you very much for the recent workshop conference you held for insular area officials to come together and get updated on potential programs coming forward. That should be very helpful. They all bring in their own unique. We always have these things when there are big programs involved, but this at the start was very helpful. Appreciate this, including the, proposed increases for, CIP, which last increase was in 1993, I think, or set TAP money and level funding for TAP and the energy, empowering energy assistance. Because as we, move forward and in the next year, I can expect about 13,000 families in the Northern Marianas who get nutrition assistance, and the roughly 16,000 people on Medicaid will face a mountain of paperwork just to keep their benefits. The 3,400 plus people in the Marianas below the poverty level will shoulder much of the burden of the broad budget cuts. And, threatening even veterans, about 700 veterans in the Marianas, threatening their care, cause delayed and missed appointments, particularly those who have to leave to go off island for their specialized care. And of course, 13,000 K-12 students. It's unfortunate. So we need to keep aware of this, abreast of this, Secretary, also, and make sure we keep the island governments, except Puerto Rico, I think, but the island governments informed. Speaking about the 13,000 K-12 students, Secretary Newland, I have been in the Ed and Labor Committee for almost the entire time I was here, and I've had this GAO report, we've had testimonies on the dilapidated state of Native American Indian schools throughout the country. We're just trying to get over and trying to work out and hopefully find peace as a result of the students who were forced to students have to wear heavy clothes, just to be in school. But hopefully the money you're asking for will help your agency, your department, work through this so that our students, the only difference is they're Native American students, will get the same education that students outside the area, the tribal areas get. So we'll support your moves also. And Secretary Cantor, the Compact of Free Association, where now Envoy Yoon is working on the Republic of the Marshalls. And hopefully once there's more clarity on these things, we would certainly like to receive some briefing, because from what I understand, Congress is going to probably break every rule it has to pass the Compact of Free Association, the three ones. And we're going to have to get it done because it's important to us more than it is to them, because they can walk away from this, but we can't. It's in our interest. So thank you, and have a good weekend. I yield, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lamalfa for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And a question for Assistant Secretary Newland. As you know, and you're able to touch on in your initial comments, well, we have this seemingly unreported, quiet pandemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I want to give you a chance to speak a little more about that, but has collaboration with the DOJ, cross agencies and other agencies, has that worked very well so far in improving the conditions? Are there any barriers to having full collaboration and more success that you're aware of?
Thank you, Congressman. Good morning. It's good to see you. So we're getting better at coordinating with the Department of Justice, both at the U.S. Attorney level and with the FBI. So on the investigative phase as well as on the prosecution phase. We have a new MOU between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the FBI on how we're going to coordinate. That's the first time we've updated that in over 3 decades. And we meet, our staffs meet weekly, and we meet at my level monthly with counterparts from the Department of Justice to address these issues.
Is there anything still that's standing in your way of being successful with, flow of information? Is there anything that's being held back that we need to be more aware of or help push on a little bit to make sure that all information is being shared as appropriate?
Thank you, Congressman. I don't have anything specific for you this morning. I will add that it's no surprise to anyone in this room that coordination amongst federal agencies is always a challenge. And we are doing better than when we started. And I feel good about the trajectory, but I would always be happy to work with you and members of the subcommittee.
You keep us informed, please, on if you feel there's a place that needs improvement or needs a push from us, or even a funding issue in the area as such, okay?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Assistant Secretary Cantor, want to shift to the Hurricane Maria situation in Puerto Rico in regard to FEMA and FEMA dollars that were sent there to help in that situation post-hurricane. We had a Homeland Security report that says FEMA didn't properly manage approximately $65 million intended for disaster relief for Puerto Rico. What are you aware of that the administration is doing to improve that and address this fraud and mismanagement that we're seeing happening in Puerto Rico with FEMA?
Congressman, OIA doesn't provide support services to Puerto Rico, but we work closely with the interagency. This is a question that I could take back and work with FEMA. We do work with FEMA on anything related to the other territories, Guam, CNMI, the Virgin Islands, and American Samoa, but not Puerto Rico.
We had last year in a T&I hearing that the GAO testified that only 19% at that point of the relief money that was allocated had actually been spent. Are there plans to move those dollars sooner? And a follow-up on that would be, I'm getting feedback from vendors down there that are doing the work in hurricane relief and cleanup and rebuild, that they're not getting paid for more than just a normal amount of time, but over a year in some cases that they're not getting paid for their work.
Sir, once again, I will take that question back and see how we can get you an answer, but this is not an area that my office oversees.
Yep.
But
yep.
we'll be happy to work with the interagency.
Okay, so that's really the two questions. At that point, there was only 19% of relief money that had gone out, and then how soon can that be? What do we expect the performance of that to be, and then vendors getting paid? Okay, one more, Ms. Cantor, on, let's see, where are we at? No, I'm sorry, this is Mr. Newland again. Okay, on law enforcement officers on Indian country, there's a $33 million request to increase that. How are we doing on helping get more law enforcement for tribes on their tribal lands?
Thank you, Congressman. I see my time is out, so I'm happy to answer if permitted. Yep. This is an area where I'm actually very proud of the improvement we've made. We've cut our attrition rate of law enforcement officers in the BIA through a pay parity initiative, And we are also reducing our vacancy rate by increasing the hiring within the BIA. And we're also working with members of Congress and both parties and both houses to address some of the other structural issues to help tribes with recruitment and retention.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Moylan for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question for Assistant Secretary Canton. Nice to see you. Assistant Secretary, as you're aware, Guam is only now emerging from Typhoon Mawar, which has ravaged the island. As we wait to see the full scope of the damage, I trust that your office will have a distinct role in the recovery efforts. In your testimony, you state that increasing severity of weather events compound infrastructure challenges and require the OIA programs to help the insular areas adapt, become more resilient, and thrive. Can you please elaborate on what efforts you will emerge to help Guam build a more storm-resilient community?
Good to see you, Congressman. And first of all, our hearts and prayers are going to the people of Guam and CNMI during this difficult time, with Super Typhoon Mawar. Just wanted to mention that a few days ago, I did speak with Governor Guerrero right before the storm hit. And I assured her that we would do everything that we could do in OIA to help the people of Guam, including we're looking at potentially reprogramming funds that could be used for help in Guam. We also have a field representative in Guam who's working very closely with the government of Guam. And here in Washington, D.C., we have members of the department that are working directly with FEMA to ensure that Guam gets the assistance that they need, especially after this devastating storm. I saw videos from the hospital and the airport, and they were really hard to watch the intensity of the storm. So again, we will do everything that we can to help Guam through this challenging time.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. Another question now, moving on to Compact Impact Funds. So Ms. Cantor, Compact Impact funding is a crucial source of funding for the government of Guam, which helps mitigate the costs associated with hosting COFA migrant communities. As of now, I'm working to ensure that there is not a gap in the Compact Impact funding for 2024. Although the Biden administration has been vocal on the question of allowing COFA migrants to benefit from federal programs while living in the United States, can you speak to the importance of maintaining Compact Impact funds for host jurisdictions?
Congressman, the Compact Impact funding was something that Congress, in 2003 determined that we were going to get funding for 20 years. And as you know, 2023 is when it sunsets. As such, I mentioned earlier that there are 94,000 compact migrants in the U.S. right now, and 50% of them are in the mainland U.S. And because of that, the administration is supporting the Compact Impact Fairness Act, which will help the migrants, no matter where they are, to receive benefits. And this is a long-term solution with no sunset clause. The department is very committed to working with Congress on, to see the intent of that legislation achieved. I also mentioned to Governor Guerrero when I spoke to her about this topic a few weeks ago that if you and her work closely with Congress on potentially acquiring some supplemental grants, OIA will be more than happy to help implementing those grants in Guam.
Okay, I understand your point. I still disagree. It's important that the hosting states and territories continue because they will continue also to migrate through the hosting states and territories, especially the most dominant being Hawaii and Guam and the Mariana Islands as well. But I understand, but the fight will continue on that. Okay. Another question here, Ms. Cantor, as OIA works to maintain partnership with the compact states, can you please speak to some of the challenges which exist at the level of subnational diplomacy? Namely, can you speak to how your office has responded to concerns as those raised by President Pueno and the Federated States of Micronesia, which relate to Chinese influence? You just
Yes, Congressman, having served in Micronesia for 2.5 years, I'm very fully aware of the challenges with, the PRC, which is mainly what President Panuelo addressed on his letter a couple of months ago. Our office supports the compact states through a series of grants and initiatives that help, keep our national security. So again, we're looking for a free and open Indo-Pacific, and we're contributing to that.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moylan, and thank you, the witness, for coming here. I'm so glad to see you, Ms. Cantor. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Assistant Secretary, the U.S. and the freely associated states currently are negotiating renewal of the Compacts of Free Association. The decrease in the Office of Insular Affairs fiscal year 2024 budget reflects the expiration of the current agreements, but does not include any future spending under the new compacts. So my question will be, how will the current negotiations impact your budget, and what changes in COFA spending are you expecting given the amounts of provided in MOUs with the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands that were signed early this year?
It's good to see you, Congresswoman. The Compacts of Free Association, as you mentioned, we just finished negotiating 2 of them, one with Palau and one with FSM. We're still working on the Marshall Islands. But the reason why you don't see that in our budget for 2024 is because OMB determined that the State Department is going to be receiving that appropriation, and the Department of the Interior will be implementing the appropriation. We're working on how that mechanism is going to work, but that's the main reason why you don't see that in our budget for 2024 and beyond.
So how do you anticipate that fiscal year 2024 budget will increase as a result of the newly negotiated compacts?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. How much do you anticipate that the negotiations, in this case, the Office of Insular Affairs fiscal budget 2024, will increase as a result of the new negotiated compacts?
We are looking at $7.1 billion for this new round, Compact 3. That nobody has called it that, but we think that's going to be the name of it. The real value, inflation adjust of the package currently being contemplated by Congress is around 14% higher than the level of assistance Congress considered prior to enactment for the previous 20-year period. So it's 14% increase.
14%. I do have questions for the Assistant Secretary, Mr. Newland. Turning to you, how much in federal funds were set aside for facilities in Indian country through all the supplemental funding bills that Congress passed since 2020, specifically for detention facilities?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make sure I understood. Are you asking how much of the funding
were set aside in Indian facilities for detention facilities?
I don't have that number top of mind. I'd be happy to get you an answer
Yes,
following
please.
here.
Can you provide that to the
Yes.
committee? What projects have specifically been completed, and what's your plan to address the rest of the facilities that need some repair or upgrades?
Yeah, so thank you, Madam Chair. With respect to our BIA jails, we've requested a significant increase through the President's FY24 budget request. And what we've done administratively is come up with a way to identify which jails are most urgently in need of repair or replacement, similar to what we do at the Bureau of Indian Education schools. And that allows us to make sure that we are taking the appropriated funds that Congress provides and putting them to their most effective use and bringing some order to that process. And so that's something that we've aimed to do. We've got some jails under construction replacement jails under construction or in process right now in different communities, and we hope to accelerate that with this budget request.
How much of those funds are being expended, and how much how much is left to spend?
Again, Madam Chair, I don't have that number top.
If you can provide that to the
Yes.
committee, I'll really appreciate that. That will be my final question.
thank
So I hope both of you got a great weekend. I want to thank the witnesses for the valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, May the 30th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there are no other further businesses, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.